Einen schönen guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, hier im Berliner Ensemble. Ich darf Sie herzlich willkommen heißen. Mein Name ist Christoph Arment. Ich bin der Chefredakteur des Zeitmagazins. Und Klaus Peimann hat mich, als wir vorhin hier angekommen sind, darauf hingewiesen, dass die Zeitmagazin-Logos viel zu klein sind. Man sollte das größer machen. Da habe ich gesagt, wir sind eben so dezent. Hat er laut gelacht. Also wir werden uns verbessern beim nächsten Mal. Ich darf Sie hier herzlich willkommen heißen im Namen des Kulturkaufhauses Dussmann, des Berliner Ensembles natürlich und des Diogenes Verlags. Und willkommen heißen zu einem Abend mit einem der großen Autoren unserer Zeit, vielfach ausgezeichnet, unter anderem mit dem Booker-Preis und dem Shakespeare-Preis. Seine Romane wie Der Zementgarten, Amsterdam und Saturday sind Weltbestseller. Und seine Romane sind zum großen Teil auch verfilmt worden, zum Beispiel Abbitte, die Verfilmung hat auch im Kino ein Millionenpublikum gefunden. Er ist 1948 geboren, lebt heute mit seiner Familie in London und auf dem Land, außerhalb der großen Stadt. Und heute Abend ist er hier, um über seinen neuen Roman Honig zu sprechen. Herzlich willkommen in Berlin. Welcome back to Berlin, Mr. Ewan McEwan. Thank you. So nice to have you back. Ewan, we just met at this very place at Berliner Ensemble 3 years ago, at the precise same date, as someone told me. Sometimes, you know, you look back and think, you know, what have you been doing in the last years? Well, we all know you've written a wonderful new book called Sweet Tooth.
Yes, that's what I was doing. I think that's what I was thinking of when I was sitting here talking about solo.
Exactly at this stage.
Exactly on this stage. I didn't know it was 3 years ago. I didn't know it was exactly 3 years ago.
Yeah. So you were thinking about doing something different this time.
I had this ghost of an idea, but it was still just a ghost. Very hard to remember. I mean, one always makes fictions about origins, you know. So I could make it up for you, but to be truthful, I know I had a few notes about this novel.
I'm actually, some people backstage ask me to sometimes translate a little bit, just
yes,
sum up
course,
things,
you must.
If you don't mind.
Excuse
but everybody,
me for not speaking German. I'm not Jonathan Franzen.
And well, we're very honored and pleased you will be reading the first few pages of the novel to us.
A little taster, and then you'll hear it in the real and beautiful language of Heine. My name is Serena Froome, rhymes with plume, and almost 40 years ago I was sent on a secret mission for the British Security Service. I did not return safely. Within 18 months of joining, I was sacked, having disgraced myself and ruined my lover, though he certainly had a hand in his own undoing. I won't waste much time on my childhood and teenage years. I'm the daughter of an Anglican bishop and grew up with a sister in the cathedral precinct of a charming small city in the east of England. My home was genial, polished, orderly, book-filled. My parents liked each other well enough and loved me and I them. My sister Lucy and I were a year and a half apart, and though we fought shrilly during our adolescence, there was no lasting harm and we became closer in adult life. Our father's belief in God was muted and reasonable, did not intrude much on our lives, and was just sufficient to raise him smoothly through the church hierarchy and install us in a comfortable Queen Anne house. It overlooked an enclosed garden with ancient herbaceous borders that were well known, and then and still are, to those who know about plants. So, all stable, enviable, idyllic even, we grew up inside a walled garden with all the pleasures and limitations that implies. The late 60s lightened but did not disrupt our existence. I never missed a day at my local grammar school unless I was ill, and in my late teens there slipped over the garden wall some heavy petting, as they used to call it, experiments with tobacco, alcohol, and a little hashish, rock and roll records, brighter colours and warmer relations all round. At 17, my friends and I were timidly and delightedly rebellious, But we did our schoolwork. We memorized and disgorged the irregular verbs, the equations, the motives of fictional characters. We liked to think of ourselves as bad girls, but actually we were rather good. It pleased us, the general excitement in the air in 1969. It was inseparable from the expectation that soon it would be time to leave home for another education elsewhere. Nothing strange or terrible happened to me during my first 18 years, and that is why I'll skip them. Left to myself, I would have chosen to do a lazy English degree at a provincial university far to the north or west of my home. I enjoyed reading novels. I went fast. I could get through 2 or 3 a week, and doing that for 3 years would have suited me just fine. But at the time, I was considered something of a freak of nature, a girl who happened to have a talent for mathematics. I wasn't interested in the subject. I took little pleasure in it, but I enjoyed being top and getting there without much work. I knew the answers to questions before I even knew how I had got to them. While my friends struggled and calculated, I reached a solution by a set of floating steps that were partly visual, partly just a feeling for what was right. It was hard to explain how I knew what I knew. Obviously, an exam in maths was far less effort than one in English literature, and in my final year at school, I was captain of the chess team. Now, you must exercise some historical imagination to understand what it meant for a girl in those times to travel to a neighboring school and knock from his perch some condescending, smirking squid of a boy. However, maths and chess, along with hockey, pleated skirts, and hymn singing, I considered mere school stuff. I reckon it was time to put away these childish things when I began to think about applying to university. But I reckoned without my mother.
Und jetzt from the language of Shakespeare to the language of Heine. Jetzt auf Deutsch. Wir heißen herzlich willkommen aus dem Ensemble des BE. Bitte einen herzlichen Applaus für Marina Senkle.
Auf Deutsch. Ich heiße Serena Froome, reimt sich auf Ruhm. Und vor knapp 40 Jahren wurde ich vom britischen Nachrichtendienst auf eine geheime Mission geschickt. Sie ging nicht gut aus. Nach nur 18 Monaten wurde ich gefeuert. Ich hatte mich blamiert und meinen Geliebten ins Unglück gestürzt, auch wenn er selbst daran wohl nicht ganz unschuldig war. Über meine Kindheit und Jugend möchte ich nicht viele Worte verlieren. Ich bin die Tochter eines anglikanischen Bischofs und wuchs mit einer Schwester neben der Kathedrale einer hübschen Kleinstadt im Osten Englands auf. Mein Elternhaus war freundlich, kultiviert, penibel aufgeräumt und voller Bücher. Meine Eltern konnten sich ganz gut leiden und liebten mich, und ich liebte sie. Meine Schwester Lucy und ich waren 1,5 Jahre auseinander, und so lautstark wir in der Pubertät stritten, blieben doch keine dauerhaften Spuren davon zurück, und als Erwachsene kamen wir uns wieder näher. Der Glaube unseres Vaters an Gott war dezent und vernünftig, drängte sich nicht allzu sehr in unser Leben und reichte gerade aus, ihn stetig die Stufen der Kirchenhierarchie erklimmen zu lassen und uns zu einem behaglichen Queen-Anne-Haus zu verhelfen. Unser Haus stand in einem umfriedeten Garten mit uralten Staudenrabatten, die bis zum heutigen Tag unter Gartenfreunden wohl bekannt sind. Kurz, alles solide, beneidenswert, wenn nicht gar idyllisch. Wir wuchsen hinter einer Gartenmauer auf, mit all den damit verbundenen Annehmlichkeiten und Einschränkungen. Die späten 60er verliehen unserem Leben eine neue Leichtigkeit, erschütterten es aber nicht in seinen Grundfesten. Im Gymnasium fehlte ich nur, wenn ich krank war. Gegen Ende meiner Teenagerzeit begann sich allerlei über die Gartenmauer zu stehlen, Petting, wie man das damals nannte. Experimente mit Tabak, Alkohol und ein bisschen Haschisch, Rockplatten, buntere Farben und insgesamt mehr Herzlichkeit. Mit 17 waren meine Freundinnen und ich begeistert, wenn auch verhalten rebellisch, aber wir machten unsere Hausaufgaben, lernten unregelmäßige Verben, Gleichungen und die Motivationen von Romanfiguren auswendig und spuckten sie auf Kommando wieder aus. Wir sahen uns gern als böse Mädchen. Tatsächlich aber waren wir ziemlich brav. 1969 lag viel Aufregung in der Luft. Und das gefiel uns. Untrennbar damit verbunden war die Erwartung, bald das Elternhaus zu verlassen und woanders zu studieren. In meinen ersten 18 Jahren passierte nichts Merkwürdiges oder Schlimmes und deshalb überspringe ich sie. Wäre es nur nach mir gegangen, hätte ich mich für ein gemächliches Englischstudium an einer Provinzuniversität im Norden oder Westen entschieden, weit weg von daheim. Romane las ich gern und schnell, 2 bis 3 die Woche. 3 Jahre lang nichts anderes tun hätte mir gut gefallen. Aber damals hielt man mich für so etwas wie ein Monstrum. Ich war ein Mädchen mit Talent für Mathematik. Das Fach interessierte mich zwar nicht und machte mir keine Freude, aber ich genoss es, die Beste zu sein. Und das ohne große Mühe. Ich kannte die Ergebnisse noch, ehe mir klar war, wie ich darauf kam. Während meine Freundinnen krampfhaft herumrechneten, gelangte ich mit ein paar schwebenden, teils augenfälligen, teils intuitiven Schritten zu einer Lösung. Es war schwer zu erklären, woher ich wusste, was ich wusste. So brauchte ich für eine Matheprüfung natürlich viel weniger zu lernen als für eine in englischer Literatur. Außerdem war ich im letzten Schuljahr Kapitän unserer Schachmannschaft. Man muss ein wenig historische Fantasie walten lassen, um zu verstehen, was es damals für ein Mädchen bedeutete, in der Schule einer Nachbarstadt anzutreten und irgendeinen überheblichen, grinsenden Klugscheißer vom Brett zu fegen. Trotzdem waren Mathe und Schach für mich nur Schulzeugs, genau wie Hockey, Faltenröcke und Kirchenlieder. Als ich über meine Studienwahl nachdachte, wollte ich mit diesem Kinderkram nichts mehr zu tun haben. Aber meine Mutter sah das anders. Sie sagte, es sei meine Pflicht, als Frau nach Cambridge zu gehen und Mathematik zu studieren. Als Frau? So sprach kein Mensch in jenen Tagen, nicht in unserem Milieu. Keine Frau tat etwas als Frau. Sie sagte mir, sie werde nicht zulassen, dass ich mein Talent vergeude. Ich solle glänzen und mich hervortun. Ich müsse als Physikerin, Ingenieurin oder in der Wirtschaft Karriere machen. Sie gestattete sich das Klischee von der Welt, die mir zu Füßen liege. Es sei unfair gegenüber meiner Schwester, dass ich sowohl klug als auch schön sei. Sie dagegen weder noch. Da wäre es noch ungerechter, wenn ich nicht nach Höherem strebe. Ich konnte dieser Logik nicht folgen, sagte aber nichts. Meine Mutter erklärte, sie würde es mir und sich selbst nie verzeihen, wenn ich Englisch studierte und am Ende bloß eine etwas gebildetere Hausfrau würde als sie. Ich riskierte, mein Leben zu vergeuden. Das waren ihre Worte und sie kamen einem Eingeständnis gleich. Es war das einzige Mal, dass sie Unzufriedenheit mit ihrem Los ausdrückte oder andeutete. Also begrub ich meinen Traum von einem Englischstudium in Durham oder Aberystwyth, wo ich bestimmt glücklich gewesen wäre, und ging stattdessen nach Cambridge, aufs Newnham College. Gleich im ersten Kurs, der im Trinity College stattfand, wurde mir klar gemacht, was für ein kleines Licht ich Mathematik war. Um eine lange, unerquickliche Geschichte abzukürzen, ich hielt durch und schaffte mit Ach und Krach meinen Abschluss. Wenn ich schon durch meine Kindheit und Jugend gestürmt bin, werde ich meine Studentenzeit erst recht raffen. Weder habe ich an Bootsfahrten teilgenommen, egal ob mit oder ohne Aufziehgrammophon, noch jemals das Footlights besucht. Theater ist mir peinlich. Noch mich bei den Garden-Hauskrawallen festnehmen lassen. Immerhin habe ich im ersten Semester meine Unschuld verloren. Mehrmals hintereinander, wie es schien. So wortlos und linkisch ging es dabei zu. Und hatte über die 9 Trimester eine ganz schöne Reihe von Liebhabern, 6 oder 7 oder 8, je nachdem, wie man Liebhaber definiert. Unter den Newnham-Frauen fand ich eine Handvoll gute Freundinnen. Ich spielte Tennis und las Bücher. Dank meiner Mutter studierte ich das falsche Fach, aber ich hörte nicht auf zu lesen. Gedichte und Theaterstücke hatte ich in der Schule links liegen gelassen, aber ich glaube, Romane bereiteten mir mehr Vergnügen als meinen Uni-Freunden, die sich wöchentlich an Aufsätzen über George Eliots Middlemarch oder Thackeray's Jahrmarkt der Eitelkeiten abrackern mussten. Ich las dieselben Bücher im Eiltempo. plauderte zuweilen mit Leuten darüber, die mein niedriges Diskussionsniveau tolerierten, und las weiter. Lesen war meine Methode, nicht über Mathe nachzudenken. Viel mehr oder weniger, es war meine Methode, überhaupt nicht zu denken. Wie gesagt, ich war schnell. Trollops The Way We Live Now verschlang ich in 4 Nachmittagen auf dem Bett. Ich erfasste ganze Textblöcke und Absätze auf einen Blick. Ich brauchte meine Augen und Gedanken nur weich wie Wachs werden zu lassen, um den Eindruck frisch von der Seite aufzunehmen. Alle paar Sekunden schlug ich, zur Irritation meiner Umgebung, mit einer ungeduldigen Handbewegung eine Seite um. Meine Bedürfnisse waren schlicht. Themenkomplexe oder gelungene Wendungen interessierten mich nicht. Und Beschreibungen von Wetter, Landschaften oder Interieurs überblätterte ich sowieso. Ich wollte Figuren, an die ich glauben konnte. Ich wollte neugierig darauf gemacht werden, wie es mit ihnen weiterging. Am liebsten las ich von Menschen, die sich fair oder entliebten, aber es störte mich auch nicht, wenn sie sich zwischendurch mit anderen Dingen befassten. Selbst wenn es banal war. Ich mochte es, wenn am Ende jemand sagte, heirate mich. Romane ohne weibliche Figuren waren eine tote Wüste. Conrad kam deshalb für mich nicht in Frage. Die meisten Erzählungen von Kipling und Hemingway ebenso wenig. Überhaupt machten große Namen keinen Eindruck auf mich. Ich las alles, was mir in die Finger kam. Groschenhefte, Hochliteratur und alles dazwischen. Ich verschlang sie unterschiedslos. Meine studentischen Lesegewohnheiten sind keine Abschweifung. Diese Bücher trugen mir meine Geheimdienstkarriere ein.
Marina Senkel, vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank.
Übrigens, wie das ganze Buch wunderbar übersetzt von Werner Schmitz. Ich finde, Übersetzern wird viel zu wenig gedankt. It's a beautiful translation by Werner Schmitz. The beginning of the novel, we've been listening to it in English and then in German. My name is Serena Froome, and almost 40 years ago, I was sent on a secret mission for the British Security Service. I didn't return safely. You're giving away so much of the novel within the first 4 or 5 sentences. Were you never afraid it would be too much to give away in the beginning? Haben Sie verraten am Anfang so viel von der Figur und was in dem Roman passieren würde? Hatten Sie keine Angst, dass Sie zu viel verraten würden?
It doesn't give away much, really. The key words there really are the one you omitted, I think, rhymes with plume. That is to say, do not take this entirely for granted as a realist novel. Expect some trickery. Spy masters, like novelists, like to control the flow of information. So I feed a little bit, but I also deceive. So this is how the spy novel must be.
Now you're mentioning the novelists with spy masters. And as Serena finds out in the next further pages, the world of espionage and literature has a lot of things in common.
Yes. What prompted me to write this novel was reading about what's called the Cultural Cold War. From the early 50s onwards, the CIA started to spend a lot of money. And by that, I mean hundreds of millions of dollars.
Also was ihn dazu gebracht hat, diesen Roman zu schreiben, war, dass der CIA in den 50er Jahren angefangen hat, den sogenannten den Kalten Krieg der Kulturen zu führen. Ne?
And the CIA in those days was staffed by highly educated professors from Yale and Harvard with good taste. And they sponsored exhibitions of abstract expressionism, touring, American painters touring Europe, tours by orchestras, symphony orchestra, Boston Symphony Orchestra. They funded secretly a festival of contemporary music in Paris. They funded, of course, your magazine De Monat and the British magazine Encounter. And the general purpose was to persuade left-of-center European intellectuals in the battle of ideas with the Soviet Union that American culture was vibrant and to preach really the values of openness, plurality, freedom of expression, and democracy. But they did it all in secret.
Some might add, there's a little
totally
contradiction.
Insane. Yeah, completely insane. Yeah. All of this could have been funded openly by a government arts agency.
Also es wurden eben damals Orchester, Musiker, Künstler aller Arten gesponsert vom CIA, um die freie Welt zu feiern, aber eben auf geheimem Weg. But also the British, I suppose the British
MI5 and 6.
They sponsored George Orwell, no?
Not directly, but they paid for 17 translations across the whole of the Warsaw Pact countries and beyond. But he didn't know that at that point. MI6 also funded various publishing houses. There's a lot to say about that, and remember, I come back to it later. But the point was that the intelligence services were penetrating, as it were, the life of the imagination. And it seemed to me an irresistible subject for a spy novel, in which the world of secrecy and the world of the imagination could somehow swap places. And so it became just a matter of finding the right love affair, because every spy novel has to have a love affair.
Also es ging eben darum, bei den Verschiebungen zwischen Spionagewelt und Literatur und der echten Welt und der fiktionalen Welt eine richtig gute Liebesgeschichte zu finden. How did you do that? What did you find it?
What did I find? Well, Serena has to go to Cambridge because that's the nest of spies, famous Burgess, Maclean, Philby. She's inducted into MI5 by, she has a lover, she meets a professor, she becomes his lover, and sooner or later she will be sent on a mission to offer a yearly pension to a young writer who bears some relation to me.
Also sie verliebt sich in einen älteren Professor, aber eben danach auch in einen Schriftsteller, dem sie dann versucht zu unterstützen, und dann geht die Geschichte voran. I mean, many great writers like John le Carré. Yeah. You're happy with the translation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a bit brief.
Okay. Shall I can extend, like,
Yeah.
you couldn't stop me. I mean,
no. I always thought German was longer than English. But now I see I was wrong.
Ich finde, die Übersetzung ist etwas kurz. Ich dachte, das Deutsche ist viel länger als das Englische.
Sehr gut, ja.
Okay, thanks.
Ja, das ist gut.
So I'm trying to be a little slower. No, but some writers like John le Carré or Graham Greene used to be spies before they became novelists.
Yeah.
What do you think makes spies good writers?
Well, working for the Secret Service helps. And that's really why we have in Britain, unlike many other countries, such a strong tradition of the spy novel as a literary genre, intact in itself with its own rules, because we had Somerset Maugham, Ian Fleming of the Bond stories, of course Le Carré, and Graham Greene, of course, and quite a few others. These writers not only were fantastic writers in their own right, but they had the experience of actually working for the agencies. And they milked their experience in ways that we can only look back with some envy.
Were you ever contacted? Wurden Sie jemals gefragt, ob Sie auch in Ihren jungen Jahren...
Would you believe my reply?
Ob ich seine Antwort glauben würde?
No, I wasn't. This is like the Cretan paradox, I always lie. I wasn't approached, and in the atmosphere of the early 70s, when I was leaving university, it would have been inconceivable for me to... I was at the wrong university for a start.
War auf der falschen Universität, gefragt zu werden.
Yeah.
Which one? Where did you go?
I was at Sussex.
All right.
You'd really have to be in Cambridge, I think.
But that could also be a great story to tell.
Yeah.
I mean, to convince people that you weren't.
The methods of recruitment in those days was what's called the hand on the shoulder.
Die Hand auf der Schulter?
Yeah. So you might have just finished your last exam and your final, you're just leaving university and there's a hand on your shoulder. And it's one of the senior tutors, a professor that maybe you haven't seen much, and he says, I gather you're interested in working for the civil service. And you say, no. And he said, well, there might be a department that's of interest to you. And you'd be gently pushed towards an interview, and you would have no idea what it was about. But as for women in those days, MI5 didn't think women could keep secrets. So
today we know it's totally different.
Now we know nobody can keep secrets.
Yes.
But in those days, they looked back on Philby, Burgess MacLean, Ken Cross, Anthony Blunt, and they thought women couldn't keep secrets. So there was a paradox. Also, they felt, because this is England, there has to be class. So the view was, despite all those spies, who were all members of the upper class, that only the upper class could be loyal to their country. So it would be very unusual, say, for someone from a humble background to have a hand on his shoulder.
So no hands on your shoulder because you went to the wrong university,
too much middle
my
class. My parents were working class. I was wrong material.
Okay,
and my opinions were not favorable to me.
Why?
Why what?
Yeah, why weren't your opinions favorable of England at the time?
Of England? No, I love England.
Or of the Secret Service?
No, well, I'm a child of the 60s. I would find it difficult to take instruction and be told what to do. And anyway, I was already by that time much more interested in the deceptions of fiction. I longed to have no job. That was my, and I've stuck to that for 45
Till
years.
Now, yeah. Also hat immer danach gesucht, keinen festangestellten Arbeit anzutreten, und das ist ihm ja auch wunderbar gelungen. In the novel, you mentioned it before right now, Ian Fleming,
yes.
the writer who obviously created the world's most famous spy, James Bond, and you mention a story in the book that you have to share with us, because I couldn't believe. Is that really a true story?
It is a true story.
Es geht eine Geschichte, die in dem Buch erwähnt wird von Ian Fleming, den Erfinder von James Bond.
It really is a story, and it's quite a complex story, about the interpenetration of the imagination as presented in novels and the intelligence services during the war. So Ian Fleming was a young intelligence officer, and he read a novel, and the novel is completely obscure, and I've forgotten its title, about an operation to get a body to float onto the shores of Spain, carrying documents. And this body would be found by your enemy, and the documents would be completely fake, and they would give all the wrong battle plans. And Fleming then took this to his superiors, and this indeed happened. The idea was to persuade the German army leadership that the Allies would invade through southern France in 1943-44. And there was a famous movie, The Man Who Never Was. But interestingly, the committee that vetted this idea.
Also Ian Fleming hat die Idee, die falschen Pläne mit einer Leiche anschwemmen zu lassen, um sozusagen die Deutschen zu verwirren, seinen Chefs vorgestellt.
The head of the committee who vetted this idea and approved it was a novelist. The British diplomat who had to receive this body and to pretend to be not interested in it was also a novelist.
Who wasn't the novelist who was involved?
Oh, the whole German army were not novelists. So right at the end of the novel, what I'm saying is that the reason in English this is called Sweet Tooth is that there's something rotten about these pointless escapades with culture by the Secret Services. And this actually was an example of a true operation driven by both a moral purpose and genuine imagination. That's all.
Now, you said you were never a member of any Secret Service, but I think some time ago you were invited to hold a speech by was it MI5?
Yes.
Also Sie wurden eingeladen vom MI5 vor nicht allzu langer Zeit, eine Rede zu halten.
Yes, everyone in MI5 is very keen readers, as we know from Serena Froome. And I was invited to come and give a lecture. So I was curious to go and see how MI5 is getting on now, because it's all very different. Nowadays, there's no hand on the shoulder.
How do they do it today, just for some of us to know?
You apply online.
No way.
Yeah.
Also heute wird online angeworben.
Yeah. And I did
so digital hand on the shoulders?
I applied online while I was writing this novel. Anybody in this room could apply online to MI5.
So no class anymore?
No.
Keine Klassenunterschiede mehr?
No.
They need everybody?
They need everybody they can get.
Yeah.
It's not very well paid. So I sat down with my son. We applied online. You have to do a test, and it's a screening test to get rid of all the stupid people. Okay. 1 hour. As soon as you click start, you have 1 hour to answer a lot of questions, and it's multiple choice: A, B, C, D, E.
Okay.
And the problem was that my son and I, Greg, who's 26, we disagreed on the answer to every question. And I said A, he said E, and then I gave my reasons, he gave his reasons, and I would say, okay, but next time it's my choice. And so before we knew it, the hour was up. And we'd answered 3 questions. And what was great about it was a tenth of a second later, it said, you have been rejected. The computer rejected us.
Also wird vom Computer nach einer Stunde
abgelehnt. You may not apply for another year.
Okay, also wenn man einmal gescheitert ist, dann darf man ein Jahr lang muss man warten or you have to use a different computer from your wife.
An alias. Yeah. You have to become a spy. Yeah.
And just to be sure, Greg is
my son.
Has not joined since that test.
He says he hasn't.
Yeah. And what was it like to actually be there? And then, because you got invited finally. Also, wie war's beim MI5?
I was in Google headquarters, and it was a bit the same, really.
Es war so wie bei Google. Google in
New York. In New York, Google headquarters. And they showed me where all the internet traffic of Europe comes in. This huge tube of cables.
Yeah.
So
was it before NSA or was it?
It was the time of NSA. It was just
they didn't have a bad. I mean, they thought it would just show it to you. Kein schlechtes Gewissen.
MI5 had a sort of atmosphere. So we were in a huge atrium, and I was speaking to about 500 agents. But when I say agents, these are guys who sit behind computer screens, like you do and I do.
Yeah.
They had that same pallor, that same and a bad back and all the rest. They're all very pleasant, and I gave a very serious lecture about the Cold War. And I thought, this is going to be amazing. I'm going to get such extraordinary questions and people telling me I'm wrong on this or that. And at the end, the first hand went up, and this rather fierce-looking guy, and I'd seen him out of the corner of my eye, and I thought, he's hostile. He said, I have to tell you that I really love Atonement, and could you explain to me why Bryony at the end of the novel, etc., etc. And I thought, wait a minute. And then the next question was, could you tell me about where you get your ideas from? And I thought, oh, I know. And then the next one was, could you tell us a little about your routine? Do you get up in the morning? Do you? And I thought, oh, well, this is just like, the rest of the world. So,
but you should have known. I mean, agents and spies are readers.
Yeah, but maybe they were all lying. I mean, maybe they knew about. I'd like to think they all knew about the Cold War, but they were keeping their cover intact. It was all very friendly. But I learned nothing.
I mean, Sie haben nichts gelernt, als Sie da die Rede gehalten haben, weil nobody wanted to discuss anything seriously.
No, no.
As we just mentioned, the NSA thing that happened this year.
Yeah.
Were you surprised? Waren Sie überrascht von NSA und von den ganzen Vorfällen?
I was rather amazed by it, and I realized how vulnerable we've made ourselves by our dependency on the internet, and the technology has driven forward at such a speed. And there's always someone who's got a slightly better technology than you have, and of course it was bound to be these trawling algorithms that could deal with your email traffic and the rest. And I think this has gone beyond anything we would have imagined possible. It's odd that Snowden should end up in Russia, and I cannot believe for a minute that he hasn't handed over, or it hasn't been extracted from him a great deal of information.
Also Sie können sich nicht vorstellen, dass Snowden, der noch in Russland ist oder vielleicht auch immer da sein wird, er schon viele Informationen den Russen, Putins Leuten übergeben hat.
One eminent human rights lawyer back in London said to me, Snowden is stupid, he should have gone to Germany.
Why?
And why? Well, he said that following the case of Bradley Manning, who was subjected to cruel and unusual punishment in his 8 months of solitude, solitary confinement. Following that, a German court would likely to be ruling that Snowden could not get a fair trial and would be subject to the same kind of punishment.
Also ein Anwalt hat gesagt, Snowden hätte nach Deutschland gehen sollen, nachdem er den Fall Bradley Manning verfolgt hat. Mrs. Merkel would have been afraid if he would have tried to come to Germany, I'm sure.
Well, my response to that was, I mean, I think it's a very good point, because had he, say, gone to London, it's more likely the British would turn him over, find some way of turning him over, because we have a special relationship. But it's perfectly possible that German secret services might owe the Americans a favor one day, or one day they want something from the Americans and they say, well, you can have that, but we want Snowden. So I don't think it'd be safe anywhere, really. But it is a matter of huge interest to me that Congress came within a whisker of passing legislation following Snowden's. And there's going to be a government commission in the States looking at the powers of the NSA. So he's already done the state some service, or he's done us some service.
Were you surprised that most people didn't really sort of emotionally react to the whole NSA scandal? I mean, there was reaction in the public, but I think most people weren't really being involved. Hat es Sie überrascht, dass zumindest in Deutschland es gab am Anfang es gab Berichterstattung ausführlich, aber es gab keinen großen Aufruhr dafür, dass der Fall eigentlich so riesig war?
We went on sending our emails, you mean, yeah, because we're addicted now to the whole thing. I don't know, I certainly became quite addicted to the story, did you not? It is a most extraordinary thing. It's something beyond what Orwell would have considered, because we are the turkeys preparing ourselves for the oven. I mean, we are bound to this process. We've made ourselves vulnerable by this need
of communication in a digital way.
Try going a day without it. It's really quite difficult. We keep saying in our household we must stop using the internet. You know, must read a book or something.
You can even read books on the internet, I mean.
But, you know, the moment in the hotel in Bonn, in Cologne, where the internet didn't work, we were down at reception saying, you know, where's the internet? You know, why can't we? We've gone 10 minutes now without. So we are party to this invasion of our own privacy. And yet we got by without it perfectly well before we knew such a thing could exist. We were still human, we fell in love, we read books, life went on. we lost nothing.
Also wir sind alle so internetabhängig, dass wir darauf nicht verzichten wollen. Als er gerade in Köln im Hotel war und für 10 Minuten kein Netz hatte, kein Internet, hat er sich unten an der Rezeption beschwert, weil er, wie wir alle, wie die meisten von uns, eben abhängig sind mittlerweile von der Art der digitalen Kommunikation. In the novel, you take us back to the sort of the era of the Cold War, and what you describe and you talk about it, the so-called binary thinking. Also in dem Roman nehmen Sie uns mit in die Zeit des Kalten Krieges. And one of the quotes that I've been reading from an interview you gave was, only if your enemy thinks something is wrong, it doesn't mean it's right.
No.
That was the way of thinking that really took place at the time.
This arose because I was talking about something that I've touched on before, and I put it into the mouth of Tom Haley, the novelist here. Why did West German novelists not write loads of novels about the wall? Such a perfect subject.
Also warum, das ist ein Thema, das ihn seit vielen Jahren umtreibt, warum haben so wenig westdeutsche Schriftsteller über die Mauer geschrieben?
Apart from the...
Peter Schneider did.
Peter Schneider's Der Mauerspringer, which is a comic reflection, actually on the way in which people could ignore the wall in the West. So, and back in the 80s, when I was researching The Innocent, my other spy novel, I asked lots of people, why aren't there more novels than Peter's novel? And one answer was, well, most writers are on the left. The wall is an abomination. They would have to attack it. But if they attacked the wall, they'd be in the same camp as the CIA and the American president.
Also die meisten, das war eine Theorie, eine Antwort war, warum es so wenig Romane über die Mauer gibt. Die meisten Schriftsteller sind politisch links eingestellt und glauben, wenn sie sich damit beschäftigen würden, dann wären sie auf der Seite der CIA.
I mean, that's dull and stupid, but the more interesting and startling answer, which is about aesthetics, someone said to me, the wall is for journalists.
Es geht um literaturästhetische Fragen. Also die Mauer ist was für Journalisten und nicht für uns Schriftsteller.
The novel is about existence, pure existence. So that was a kind of aesthetic statement that the novel really only contemplates the sort of pure being. It was a Hegelian notion of the novel. Whereas I would say, you know, if there was a wall in Chicago, Saul Bellow would, of course, attend to it. But now this is changing, isn't it? I mean, and perhaps all that shows is that novels take a long time to gather up their subject. Ideas percolate through like hundreds of feet of soil to come out as pure water.
Es hat sich geändert. Jetzt erscheinen ja viele Romane seit einigen Jahren über die Mauer und über die Zeit. Damals Literatur dauert manchmal ein bisschen länger. Have you ever personally thought about writing a novel about the wall?
I predicted the wall's fall at the end of The Innocent. I never got credit for it.
No,
I mean,
now
all
today,
of these secret services, they didn't see it coming.
Aber Sie haben es vorausgesehen. Ja?
Yeah, right at the end of The Innocent, which I finished in June of 89. I said in the last lines of that novel, these two lovers must meet again and look at the wall one last time before they tear it down.
But the novel came out afterwards.
Yeah, I know, it's so annoying. So
Der Roman ist vorher geschrieben worden, aber danach erschienen, blöderweise.
Yeah, the novel came out in February.
Yeah, the wall had been... Yeah. But there's proof, I suppose, that you actually written it in June.
Is there proof? I didn't really...
Maybe I mean...
taken it to a solicitor.
No, but since then, you never had the idea of writing a novel.
No, I still think about it. I mean, I was fascinated. At the age of 13, I mean, when the wall was only a year old, I made a photographic study of it. I'd just been given a camera for my birthday. And I took loads of color photographs. And this was when the wall was still bricked up houses, windows bricked up. And you could get right up to it. There was none of that no man's land.
Also als Schüler hat er Aufnahmen gemacht, als junger Mann, gerade die erste Kamera und dann Farbaufnahmen der Mauer. Warum waren Sie damals in Berlin? Why were you there?
Well, my father was in the army, and we were having a holiday in Berlin in 1962, 3, somewhere around there.
Maybe 4.
Yeah. And I've looked at those photographs, finally looked at them a few months ago, and the problem is that they're so good that I begin to doubt that I took them.
Die Fotos sind so gut, dass Sie das Gefühl haben. Have they ever been published?
No, but the reason I haven't published them is I dread that I publish them and write a little essay, and then someone from Magnum or photo agency say, "Wait a minute, these photographs, they just look a little too good for anything." When I look at all the other photographs I took, they're all blurred and shaky. Why are these pictures? So I'm a little worried about publishing them.
But I'm an editor of a magazine, so if you want to publish them, we can. It would be
okay if you protect me against a copyright scandal. When it turns out to be some famous photographer that I.
Yeah, we will write another story about it.
Yeah, about me in prison.
In the novel, you take us back to the 70s, in the late 60s and early 70s, in that era, also in England. And England, as you've been writing in the novel, quite in detail, had been a totally different country at the time. What was it like, England in the 70s? Sie beschreiben, der Roman spielt sehr viel in den 70er Jahren in England, ein ganz anderes Land als das, was wir heute kennen, auf vielen Ebenen.
In the sort of political, collective, social world, we were having a kind of nervous breakdown. The memories of the war and the lost empire were still very strong, especially amongst those who were in positions of power. We looked around and saw that the vanquished, the defeated nations, Germany and Japan, seemed to be running themselves so much better and more smoothly, and their industry and their whole kind of social organizations seemed to be superior.
Ausgerechnet in Deutschland und Japan, die den Krieg verloren hatten, ging es viel besser als in den 70er Jahren, als England ging.
We had an energy crisis, we had an economic crisis, we were hugely in debt. There were strikes all the time, the management was very arrogant, unions were sometimes crazily politicized.
3-day working week?
We had a 3-day week to save energy. We had 5 states of emergency in 4 years. I mean, it really was an extraordinary time. But I was, in 1970, I was 22, so I was aware of all this going on, but I was just starting to publish my first stories and meeting the friends in the literary milieu in London who would become my lifelong friends.
Also ausgerechnet in der Zeit dieser Krise hat er seine Karriere begonnen, seine Freunde gefunden in der literarischen Welt in London, mit denen er bis heute allen noch befreundet ist, anderen Schriftstellern.
And London in the 70s, in many ways, was not as interesting or as nice as it is now. It was dirty, the food was dirty, but it was very exciting for me to be there, and I loved it. So it's that twin aspect that I tried to catch in the novel. You can be having the most wonderful time in your life while there's a massive crisis going on around you. In fact, it even helps you feel even happier in a way. We all want to feel we live in important times, and there was that sense of urgency.
Also er hatte eine gute Zeit in den 70ern, wie viele andere auch seiner Generation, obwohl es dem Land eigentlich nicht so besonders gut ging. At the end of that decade, am Ende dieses Jahrzehnts, a lady called the Iron Lady took over, Maggie Thatcher. Am Ende dieses Jahrzehnts wurde Maggie Thatcher Premierministerin und hat das Land ja sehr stark verändert. What did you think of her in the beginning? Was haben Sie am Anfang über sie gedacht?
Well, like most writers, most intellectuals, profoundly distrustful, and then that distrust turned into profound dislike, I guess. She came and basically disrupted the post-war kind of welfare state agreement between left and right that we have a corporatist center-led government, And that agreement fell apart with her rise. And she imposed the market solutions instead of the welfare solutions.
Also sie hat den Sozialstaat bekämpft und dann eben sowas gesagt wie there is no thing such a society. So.
Yes, I mean that was just a tiny bit of it. She put us through, or the country went through something not unlike what Germany went through maybe 10 or 12 years ago, but it was ruthless and fast, and it brought a kind of money value to what were then considered social values. And everyone was very uneasy, and it really decimated communities too. So even looking back, one thinks there must have been a better way of doing this. I mean, it came to a head.
She was very radical
radical on the right.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, she was kind of radical in these matters, but in social matters, very conservative too. She spoke, for the family and family values and all those other important beacons of the right. And in many ways, there were things that absolutely needed to change, and the left had been trying to do it for a long time too, especially in industrial relations. But I don't know. I think, Germany went through it, early 2000.
5 and 5 and 6. Yeah.
From a distance, it looked like you were doing it in a more kindly fashion, but it probably looked very different here. I don't know.
Schröder lost the next election.
Yeah.
Before that. Yeah. Also Deutschland hat es etwas sozialer gemacht, die Reformen, aber in England waren es damals sehr brutal, sehr, sehr radikal.
Yeah.
Have you changed your mind about her later on?
No, I wrote a piece when she died, and in some ways there were things that had to change. Down at the sort of small level, the state really had become very imposing. If you wanted to change where your telephone socket was, you had to write away, and maybe 12 weeks later a man would come and you had to sign a lot of documents, and you could put the socket just under the window, it was been by the door. All that vanished.
Also Bürokratie wurde sehr, sehr stark bekämpft von ihr, das ist alles verschwunden.
You weren't allowed, no newspaper, this would interest you, no newspaper could let the readers know what was on television the day after tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Because that was a monopoly of the Radio Times, a magazine I worked for, actually. So there were lots of petty obstructions, but the social cost was very, very high.
I was thinking when I was reading the novel, were you ever sort of a hippie type of guy?
No, I really went at it.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What kind of dresses? War schon eine Art Hippie.
Well, in 1972, with 2 American friends, I bought a VW microbus in Amsterdam. We drove it.
In Amsterdam? Well, that's a very hippie-esque thing to stay
exactly,
there.
Exactly, yes.
Also in Amsterdam.
We kitted it out with sound, and we headed off to the sounds of Neil Young towards Munich, stopped in Munich. So yes, it was 72, it was the Games, actually.
Ah ja. Während der Olympischen Spiele ist er dann nach München gefahren. Und did you actually watch the games?
No, but I...
No, you would like...
No,
smoking and...
I did see the most terrible violence in Munich. It's the only time I've ever seen a man shot in the head with a gun. But it turned out to be a starting pistol.
Ah.
Well, it was the Games, so there must have been a lot of starting pistols.
Also jemand hat auf einen Kopf gezielt.
But he put it right in the man's eye. So it was a fight. That was really shocking. But we drove to Afghanistan, through Iran, Turkey, stayed many months on the road, got as far as Peshawar, and then started to head back slowly. But yes, but all the time I was jolting around in this bus, and sometimes, and driving this bus, sometimes 15 miles an hour. There were no proper roads across eastern Turkey, and the road to Kandahar from Herat was very difficult. All the time I was thinking, I'd just love the sun to stop shining. I'd love to be under a grey sky in England where I could think clearly and return to writing stories. So I was desperate by the end of this. I thought, that's it. I've done my 6 months of hippie
Of sunshine.
life. Yeah.
You went back to England. No
I went back to
sunshine.
England, I cut my hair, I thought, I just got to think straight. You know, no more of this, I can't.
Also nach 6 Monaten war die Hippie-Phase zu Ende, nachdem es auch zu heiß war vor Kandahar. What's your opinion on Mr. Cameron? Because we've talked about Mrs. Thatcher.
Well, I think
Was hält er von
it's a kind of
David
ghost
Cameron?
arising from, I mean, we've just sold off our post office. Do you still own your post office? We've sold ours to the market. It seemed to most of us very fond of our post office.
It's famous. I mean,
yeah, it's been around hundreds of years, and letters come. It has got a little more inefficient, I suppose, but it was sold well below its real value. So within a day, the shares had gone from £3.30 to £4.80. So basically, the taxpayer had transferred a vast, hundreds of millions of pounds to the city. And it felt...
Also die Post wurde privatisiert für viel zu wenig Geld und nachdem sie privatisiert worden war, ist der Wert der Aktie nach oben geschossen. Das heißt, die Bevölkerung hat, die Steuerzahler haben die City, also den Finanzteil von London, jede Menge Geld geschenkt, unfreiwillig.
So it did feel like the sort of return of those days of the radical right in power. And I think in many ways the ghost of Mrs. Thatcher hangs very heavily over the Conservative Party, over the government, but also over the country. So what we saw with this sell-off was really, you know, like a genie coming out of the bottle, and it's Mrs. T.
Also Margaret Thatcher hängt wie ein Geist über David Cameron und wie Genie aus der Flasche.
Ja.
Flaschengeist.
Aus der Flasche.
Aus der Flasche.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the language of Heine. It sounds different.
More the Goethe, I think. Aus der Flasche.
Some months ago, you were asked by a reporter, I think from the Wall Street Journal, if you had some reading advice for Mr. Obama. Ob Sie einen Lesetipp für Herrn Obama hätten. And you recommended a poem. Sie haben ihm ein Gedicht empfohlen. Why a poem?
Well, I imagine that everybody wants the President of the United States to read, you know, where we are now, where we should be heading. And I wanted him to cultivate some solitude and inner stillness. And the poet I recommended, I think, is perhaps the best poet, now that Seamus Heaney has died, the best poet writing in English. And that is James Fenton. A wonderful mix of both beautiful love lyrics, but also a kind of where morality and politics sort of merge. You can't quite say these are political poems, but they are really about the human condition. Poem about Jerusalem, poems actually about the two wonderful poems about Germany. He spent quite a good time here. He was a foreign correspondent, so he's a poet who's really
Journalist.
Got his hands dirty, covering Vietnam War and.
Also James Fenton hat er Obama empfohlen. Der hat auch 2 Gedichte über Deutschland geschrieben. Where were these poems about German? The 2 poems about Germany. Die 2 Gedichte über Deutschland.
He has a terrifying line. It's about some old Nazis drinking beer. And
what a
says,
surprise!
We love to sit around and. We love to sit around and forget about the old times. Yeah. That's one of the lines, which I'm misquoting, actually. It's much better than that. But that's its gist. It's about memory, about the importance of memory.
Would you have some reading advice for Mrs. Merkel? Hätte er auch einen Lesetipp für Angela Merkel?
Oh, I don't know. No, I'm going to pass on that. No, don't take me down that road.
Why not?
Well, I don't know what she likes, so I would want to give her something she doesn't like. Clearly she needs to read something French, you know, too.
Also es sollte auf jeden Fall etwas Französisches sein, was sie lesen sollte.
I know, Cousin Bette. How about that?
Why?
She needs to fall in love with France again, I think. Or Germany needs to fall in love with France again. Get that old Paris-Bonn, Paris-Berlin axis it's nice and strong.
That's the Britain you saying.
Yes, we need that axis.
Some British irony here.
Yeah, no, not irony. No, I think the EU was founded on the post-war efforts to bind those countries, and that's what's made it very strong. We get bored by peace. People don't realize, what a brilliant success the EU has been. So peaceful. France and Germany bound together. So yes, she would have to read Welbeck. How about that?
Also der Lesetipp für Angela Merkel ist Michel Welbeck. Da denken wir jetzt nach.
She's probably read them all.
Ja, Elementarteilchen. Das ist sein berühmtester Roman auf Deutsch. I was thinking, doing research before we had this wonderful encounter here tonight. What were actually the first books that you have been reading yourself as a child? Do you remember some of these? Was waren eigentlich die Bücher, die Sie als Kind gelesen haben?
Well, I came from a very unliterary family, though we didn't own books at home.
Es gab keine Bücher zu Hause, no books?
No. And my parents both left school at 14, and neither of them ever had children's classic books. Nobody read to them in bed, and they didn't have any favorite books of that. So they never passed on any particular books to me in the way that parents do. On the other hand, because they had left school, both of them, and my father's Scots, my mother England, so we're far apart, but they had the same experience, leaving school at 14 to go straight into work. Because they'd missed out on all that, they had a very high opinion of it, both of education and of books. So when we lived in North Africa, in Tripoli, my father was stationed there, and we were there for most of my, from the age of 6 to 12. So that was a formative time. Every Tuesday we would go to the army library, and it had a small children's section.
Also jeden Dienstag in Nordafrika, wo der Vater stationiert war, über 6 Jahre, ist mit seinem Vater. You went with your father or your mother?
Yeah, and my mother. All three of us would go.
Die 3 Eltern zu dieser Bibliothek, und dann haben sie nachgeschaut, was es dort gab an Kinderbüchern.
And I was left alone to just get my 3 books, and I worked my way through the whole of the shelves, but indiscriminately. I mean, I had no idea, and I think that's actually what gave me the taste. I would take a book down and just look at the opening 3 or 4 lines, and if it didn't grab me, I'd put it back.
Also es ging um die ersten 3, 4 Sätze, und wenn die Sie dich interessiert haben, dann haben Sie sie wieder zurückgestellt ins Regal. Is that, I think, in a way that really sort of made you as a writer as well? I mean, because you're really careful of the beginnings of your books.
Yes, it made me pay a great deal of attention to...
Because you didn't want your books to be put back on the shelf.
Exactly. No writer wants that, so I don't claim any unorthodoxy. But I then discovered my love. I mean, I read a lot as a child, but and I love books about children who suddenly find themselves without any grown-ups.
Also Kinderbücher ohne Erwachsene,
so
in denen keine Erwachsene vorkommen.
The parents would somehow vanish, die, or it would be long summer holidays, and they would go off to stay with some crazy aunt, and then you would be free, free of the world. And maybe that's why I came to write the novel *The Cement Garden*. What would happen with children without adults? And I love stories by Enid Blyton. Now, Enid Blyton...
Enid Blyton kennen wir natürlich auch in Deutschland.
Is she known in Germany?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, Enid Blyton.
Well, we have such good taste. Because in the 60s and 70s, she was banned.
She was banned in the UK?
Yeah. Along with Lady Chatterley's Lover, almost. She was banned because librarians thought that, well, I don't actually know what they thought. She was too sexist, or no, that was before even feminism. It was too easy, too sugary, I don't know.
Enid Blyton war bei den 50ern, 60ern also nicht erlaubt zu lesen. Es war also zensiert.
But I love those Island of Adventures, Circus of Adventures.
Absolutely.
Oh, God, I read them all. So I never got given, Tolkien or, all the usual things. I had to find my own way. What I liked about Enid Blyton, actually, and I wrote a long essay about her in my final year at university, from a Freudian perspective.
That's a very grown-up thing to do.
Yeah, it was.
Also aus der Sicht von Freud, eine Analyse von Enid Blytons Werk.
Yeah. And there's lots to write about from that perspective. This is when I still believed in Freud.
Es war die Zeit, als noch an Freud geglaubt hat.
But actually, I think one of the reasons that she was so powerful in children's imagination is her writing had such clarity. You knew immediately, you could see where you were. And actually she had good openings too. So I think that also had an effect on me.
Also es ging eben darum, dass sie eben sehr klar geschrieben hat, man wusste immer, wo man ist, und er glaubt, dass das tatsächlich einen großen Einfluss hatte auf seine Arbeit später als Schriftsteller.
If I were to say in England on a public stage that I count Enid Blyton as one of my major influences, it would be the end of me. But it's okay in Germany.
I have bad news for you, because this is broadcast, this is live streamed.
Oh yeah, but NSA will interrupt it.
Also wir werden danach beobachten, ob die Karriere von Ian McEwan zu Ende ist, jetzt nach diesem Abend, nachdem er gestanden hat, dass Enid Blyton einen großen Einfluss auf ihn ausgeübt hat. Was that long enough for you, the translation?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, you're getting better.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. You mentioned that you've read all her books, and I think rereading books is something that you continually do. Is it something that you want readers to do as well with your books?
Well, all writers want to be reread, and it's a fairly hopeless and foolish ambition. There are so many novelists now. I mean, God, we are a seething horde. My wife told me this evening a factoid about Iceland. 10% of the Icelandic population will publish a book in their lifetime. Amazing.
Oh, by the way, your wife is here. Should we give a warm welcome to Mrs. Ian McEwan? Yes, she.
I have no idea what she is.
She's here tonight. She's traveling with you.
She has never been called Mrs. Ian McEwan before.
Is that a very British way? No.
Wait till she gets me home. Yeah. She's Annalena McAfee.
She's a journalist you met during an interview for the Financial Times.
Yes, she came to interview me.
And I read another interview that you gave the Financial Times reporter last year, and you said, well, there's something strange I have to tell you, is that last time I did an interview with a reporter from the FT, I fell in love.
Yeah.
I can't do that again.
No. No, not at my age.
Also ich übersetze es einmal. Es passiert in seinem Alter passiert ihm das nicht mehr, dass er sich in Reporter der Financial Times verliebt. Hat er einmal gemacht in eine Journalistin, und die ist seine Frau geworden. In Sweet Tooth, Honig, as it's called in German. I mean, when you've read the book, as I can say, when I read the book and I'd finished it, you automatically want to reread it because of some of the tricks you've mentioned, because of some of the things. Is that something that you think about, that you sort of, you get the readers to read the book once and then, give them some hints and say, okay?
Long ago, I'd had an ambition, but I didn't know the precise story that would fulfill this. The ambition would be that when the reader got to the last 2 or 3 sentences, everything that had been read so far was turned through 90 degrees and had to be then seen again. So it seemed a spy novel was the place to do that. Sometimes you learn something and it tilts your world perspective irrevocably. And so in a minor way, I wanted to do something like that. So it would please me enormously. And I know I've met all sorts of people who said, now I have to read it again. I know they're lying.
I'm not lying.
Oh, no, but not everybody's going to have to talk about it at the Berliner Ensemble. so of course you had to read it twice.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for reading it twice.
Yeah.
You're probably the only one.
It's not true, but you're fishing for compliments now.
It's the only way to get them.
Also das muss ich nicht übersetzen. Fishing for compliments. Manchmal ist das der einzige Weg, sagt er, wie man Komplimente bekommen kann. Now, the young novelist in the novel, Tom Haley, has some characteristics that remind the reader of the young Ian McEwan. Also Tom Haley, die junge Hauptfigur im Roman, hat bestimmte Ähnlichkeit mit Ian McEwan. In which way?
Well, Serena goes down to offer him some money because MI5 think that he's just their kind of writer, partly from his essays. She goes down to pretending that she works for an arts organization, and they want to give him a stipend, a pension, so that he can concentrate on his writing and stop teaching. And so I sent her down to Sussex as I remembered it, 1972. And I gave him some short stories. Serena has read his short stories before she gets there. Do you want to translate them?
Yeah, if you want me to. Yeah, sure.
Well, I don't know how many people are understanding me.
Oh yes, they're all understanding you, but you know,
okay.
still it feels comfortable to hear sometimes.
Yeah, some people aren't.
Yeah.
Okay.
They all do. Also Serena verliebt sich in Tom Haley und tut so, als ob sie ihn unterstützen würde und verliebt sich in ihn, lernt ihn kennen. Und Ian McEwan macht etwas, was zu dem besonderen Vergnügen dieses Romans gehört. Er gibt Tom Haley einige Kurzgeschichten, die er selber geschrieben hat.
So I went back to 3 or 4 of my own stories from that time, partly to get myself into the spirit of those days, and I recast them, I changed them a little bit.
Also sie sind ein bisschen verändert worden. Er hat sie vorher gelesen und dann etwas modifiziert für den Roman jetzt.
And I found a convention so that the reader could be reading over Serena's shoulder. I didn't want to just put the stories in there. It would be too disruptive of the narrative. So I condensed them. And I gave him something of the literary milieu of London in early 70s. Around the magazine The New Review, which was not funded by the CIA. It was funded by the Arts Council. I mean, that's how it all should have been done.
Also das Londoner literarische Milieu in dieser Zeit, in dem sich Ian McEwan aufgehalten hat, hält sich auch Tom Haley in dem Buch auf.
Yeah. And that's about it, really. I mean, no beautiful woman ever came into my office to offer me a pension. So this is a very distorted biography. But I thought it would be fun to just play with some parts of my own earlier fiction, just go back and get them out. Some of them I had not read since I wrote them.
And
since
what
I
was
corrected the proof, in fact.
Okay, so what was it like rereading them? Wie war es, diese Geschichten, die frühen Geschichten nochmal zu lesen für ihn?
Well, I have to say that I was somewhat under the influence, not of Enid Blyton, but of Samuel Beckett. And in the trilogy of Beckett, he has this habit of using commas instead of full stops. And it looks so affected now when I read the stories. I want to take a blue pencil and
edit them.
Put them back. But apart from that, I quite like them. Yeah. I'll stand by them. I'm not going to get rid of them.
Also abgesehen von den Kommata statt Punkten, das hat er sich von Samuel Beckett damals abgeschaut, fand er sie noch ziemlich gut, als er sie gerade gelesen hat, die Kurzgeschichten. The Tom Haley character meets a writer who really existed, and still does, of course, Ian Hamilton.
Yes.
And Hamilton gives him some advice.
Oh, you have to remind me.
He tells him a story about another writer who wrote about his own marriage.
Oh, yes. Of course, yeah.
Ian Hamilton erzählt ihm eine Geschichte über einen anderen Schriftsteller, der über seine eigene Ehe einen Roman veröffentlicht hat, and then things go terribly wrong.
Yes. It's a problem. Some novelists raid or plunder their own lives and the lives of people around them, and it causes absolute chaos
Also manche Schriftsteller beuten ihr eigenes Leben aus, aber nicht nur ihr eigenes, sondern auch das private Leben der Menschen, mit denen sie leben. Und das
I don't think I'm in that camp really. I have used bits and pieces of people, but I'm quite good at disguising it. I once put my son in a novel in Saturday.
Greg?
Yeah, Greg. But I also made him a brilliant blues guitarist, so he was willing to forgive me, I think. And anyway, I showed it to him. I mean, if he'd objected, I would have taken it out.
Also Greg, sein Sohn ist einmal eben in Saturday als Figur vorgekommen, aber da war ein brillanter Blues-Gitarrist und deshalb war er nicht böse. Außerdem durfte er es vorher lesen und war einverstanden mit der Veröffentlichung. When you published Saturday, which is one of my favorite novels of you, you were some people criticized you for writing about a happy family.
I know, it was...
Also es gab Kritik, die Familie sei zu glücklich, über die geschrieben werde, und das sei doch wirklich zu kitschig, zu langweilig.
It was odd because when I published those stories, which were very dark and contained every human perversity I could think of, murder and rape and child molestation and all kinds of crazy dark things happening, incest, yes. The critics loved me. And when I wrote about a man who the woman he loves happens to be his wife, and which is always a stroke of luck.
Also über einen Roman geschrieben hat, über einen Mann, der seine Frau wirklich liebt, was
das ist glücklich.
That was luck.
And also to have two children who are not drug addicts or don't hate their parents.
Dessen Kinder auch noch nicht mal Junkies geworden sind oder auch noch ihre Eltern lieben, zumindest nicht hassen.
Some critics thought I had written the filthiest possible thing you could ever evoke. So yes, I got some stick for that. Happiness is hard to do in a novel. That's why we have poetry for happiness, because happiness doesn't last very long.
Also das Glück ist schwer in einem Roman zu beschreiben, deswegen gibt es Gedichte. In Gedichten kommt Glück sehr viel vor, weil Glück verstreicht sehr schnell.
Yeah. So the lyric poem is our great literary form for catching on the wing happiness. And the novel, because it's long, chases human fates over time. So that will contain stretches of happiness, but it's not given to us to be constantly happy.
Also im Roman geht es natürlich viel mehr um die Auf und Abs des Lebens. Is that why you really prefer the novella? Warum Sie die Novelle eigentlich eher mögen als den klassischen Roman?
No, I love the novel, but the novella for different reasons. But I mean, the only place people are going to be constantly happy all the time, everyone, is heaven. Which is why we don't want to go there. We'd go crazy. It's not in our nature. Sooner or later, conflict arises, boredom sets in. A stranger arrives, classically in a novel. The great, and I've said this many times in public, but I mean, the great expression of extended happiness, and it lasts for about 150 pages, is in Anna Karenina, the early days of Levin's marriage, which is Tolstoy reflecting in the early days of his own.
Also 150 Seiten Anna Karenina, da findet das Glück statt.
Yeah, and that is absolutely glorious to read. And what happens? A stranger arrives, an old friend of Levin comes, and
dann kommt der Fremde, taucht auf, und dann
and there's a
verändert sich
moment of
alles.
jealousy, and everything starts to fall apart with Kitty. It's beautifully done. But it does end. It's marvelous. So anyway, I thought I would have my Tolstoyan moment, and got beaten by some sticks by some critics.
Ja, also er dachte, als er Saturday veröffentlicht hat, er hatte seinen Tolstoi-Moment, und in Wirklichkeit gab es einige Kritik, aber natürlich it was a great success with the audience and with other critics as well. I know that you've been saying that in public many times, your favorite writer is Shakespeare. one of your favorite. I mean, probably. I mean, you're not the only one in the world.
Quite,
but
yeah, that's a strange view. Yes,
yeah, I know.
And Enid Blyton, of course.
And Enid Blyton. Yeah. So I was going to ask you if you had a question for Shakespeare if you meet him, but of course now I have to ask you first. Would you have a question for Enid Blyton if you meet her?
No, I wouldn't have a question for Enid Blyton, but I would. I mean,
Also hätte er eine Frage an Shakespeare.
Every time I come away from a Shakespeare play, I always feel this sort of little tug of sadness, because behind the poetry, behind the blank verse, you sense a wonderful, social, sensual person that you would love to spend time with.
Also jedes Mal, wenn er aus einem Shakespeare-Stück rausgeht, gibt es eine bestimmte Traurigkeit in ihm, die aufsteigt, weil er diese spezielle Persönlichkeit, weil sie die spüren und gerne kennenlernen würden.
And the question would be, obviously, why did you stop?
Warum haben Sie aufgehört? Das wäre
Why
die Frage
go
an
back
Shakespeare.
to Stratford after writing The Tempest? And one answer has come up recently, and it's caused a lot of excitement. The answer is that he didn't. And what he did.
Vor kurzem kam eben raus, er hat nicht aufgehört zu schreiben.
Well, he collaborated a great deal, maybe rather more than we ever thought, because we now have computer-driven text analysis to find word groups now dotted around a whole range of other plays.
Also es gibt jetzt, die Computer helfen einem mittlerweile eben die Analyse von Texten so vorzuschreiben, dass man eben merkt, dass bestimmte Wörter, die miteinander gruppiert sind, plötzlich auch in fremden Texten von demselben Schriftsteller sein können.
But why he stopped and went back and still had another 12 years to live, 8 years to live, is a mystery still. Why not? I mean, where are the Shakespeare plays, not the collaborations, but the Shakespeare plays? So maybe he was ill, I don't know. Maybe he felt guilty.
Why guilty?
Well, he'd left his wife for a long time. His son Hamlet had died, some years earlier. So maybe he thought it was time to fulfill his functions as a family man, I don't know.
I mean, because you mentioned Hamlet, I think you really like Hamlet, reading Hamlet and going...
I love the first 3 acts. I'm always when Hamlet comes back from England...
Also wenn Hamlet zurückkommt nach England, dann haben Sie ein bisschen Zweifel?
It's great when he's sulking around in the court. Because then we get those the best of those reflections on his hesitation. When he comes back, there's some marvelous poetry, but dramatically it doesn't seem to me quite as interesting.
Would that be a conversation that you would have with him and with
No,
Shakespeare?
I wouldn't dare. What? Say too bad about Hamlet? Yeah. Sorry, old boy. Not your best. No, I don't even say it to Julian Barnes, so I'm not going to say it to Hamlet.
Also er sagt es nicht mehr zu Julian Barnes und würde es erst recht nicht zu Shakespeare sagen, wenn ihm irgendwas nicht gefallen würde. You've been describing yourself as an optimist a couple of times in interviews you gave. What makes you feel so optimistic generally?
It's very hard to separate out your wish for things and one's predictions, so these are always bound up.
Er hat sich öfter als Optimist bezeichnet.
I think my optimism began probably with having children. And maybe optimism is not quite the word. Your position shifts. You can allow yourself the luxury of the darkest pessimism when you're very young, because you have little stake in the world, and you think, well, it could all go to hell. Who cares? Let it come down. Once you have children, you suddenly have a stake in the human project. You want it to continue. You want good, rational laws to be passed. You want social conflicts to be resolved. You want the earth not to overheat.
Also die Kinder haben ihn verändert.
So it really does. It is a small local thing that then balloons out into a world view.
Modish pessimism is something that you disgrace, no? I mean, diese Art von Pessimismus, die so ein bisschen modisch geworden ist.
Well, no, I think it's a luxury.
Mhm. Ist ein Luxus, it's a problem, it's a luxury problem, or is it?
No, it's a luxury of youth. You can have that wild pessimism. It's delicious too. I mean, most intellectuals in the humanities are pessimists because pessimism is intellectually delicious.
Ja, die meisten Intellektuellen sind Pessimisten, weil es natürlich sehr reizvoll ist.
And that's not to say that we aren't facing disasters, just because we say it's so. But one of the reasons I love the company of scientists is that they see the same problems, but they think how we will solve them.
Deshalb mag ich Wissenschaftler so, weil die sehen dieselben Probleme, aber sie versuchen sie zu lösen.
But many of the social critics in the humanities just want to glorify, I mean, not glorify, they just want to be down there with how it is failing. So, and of course this is a very broad brush description. But I love, there's a new kind of public intellectual who is often a scientist deeply versed in his or her subject, but also perfectly well read as you or me and maybe better. They can have their feet in our camp.
Also es gibt einen neuen Typus von Wissenschaftlern, die genauso belesen sind und genauso viel schreiben können und die eben auch auf der geisteswissenschaftlichen Seite oder eben als Schriftsteller oder als Autoren arbeiten können.
And they've read Tolstoy and they go to the opera and they can whistle the Bach D minor double concerto. But they know about Dirac's equation. But also they enter the fray of the public discussion, maybe with a view on evolutionary biology or about how the internet might change our nature. And I love this new shift. There's one website run by a friend of ours called John Brockman called The Edge. Yeah, and The Edge is a wonderful meeting place of scientists talking to each other mostly. And to talk to each other outside their special knowledge, they have to speak in a lingua franca of just plain English. So
also es gibt diese wunderbare Webseite theedge.org von John Brockman, einem ehemaligen Literaturagenten, der Wissenschaftler zusammenbringt, die untereinander diskutieren, und das ist eine neue Art von Wissenschaftler.
And that's fundamentally an optimistic project.
Okay.
Edge.org.
Und das ist ein Projekt von Optimisten, ein optimistisches Projekt. Ian, your publishing house, Diogenes in Switzerland, they're so modern that they have asked some of the readers who can't be here tonight on Facebook.
All right.
A question or two that they would like to share with you. And,
okay.
So I'll share some of the questions from your readers to you. There's Andrea Putz asking, how good were you in school writing essays?
Oh.
Also seine Leserin Andrea Putz hat auf Facebook gefragt, wie gut waren Sie in der Schule, wie gut waren Sie im Schreiben?
I was painfully shy as a child. So even when I knew the answer to things, which was about maybe 1/3 of the time, I didn't dare speak. I mean, my tongue just froze. And if a teacher looked at me, I'd feel my stomach, something cold in my stomach.
Also er war so schüchtern, dass er nie irgendwas gesagt hat. But did you write? Were you good in writing?
Not particularly.
Auch nicht im Schreiben, nicht besonders gut?
No. In a class of 30 children, I would be, 15th. Her privates we is Rosencrantz.
Also er war so ungefähr 15. von 30. Marissa Conradi has a question asking, have you ever been dreaming about certain scenes of a novel and then putting them into your novel later on? Haben Sie jemals eine Szene geträumt und sie später dann aufgeschrieben?
No, I've never found dreams particularly helpful. I'm quite good at nightmares, actually.
Also Träume haben ihm nicht besonders geholfen, aber in Albträumen ist er sehr gut.
Annalena will tell you that sometimes the neighborhood echoes to the sound of my screams.
Also die Schreie von Ian sind sehr laut, seine Nachbarn können davon einiges erzählen. And the last question from a reader is her name is, they're all women. I mean, I hope, you know.
Yeah, we could talk about that if you like.
Yeah? I'll ask the last,
Yeah.
Tell me now.
No, ask her question and then I'll tell you.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Daniela Biel would like to know, what is a place where you mostly like to enjoy, mostly like to write? I mean, what's the most, is there a special, a room or a part of your house where you enjoy writing?
Well, I have a study.
Also ein Arbeitszimmer, in dem er am liebsten schreibt.
It's a converted barn, so it's spacious. It's got loads of books, 2 desks, one for longhand, one for a big computer. No, I'm very lucky to have it. It's a wonderful place to work. But I'm quite good at working in a hotel, in a neutral environment.
Okay, er arbeitet auch sehr gerne im Hotel, schreibt gerne im Hotel, weil es ein neutrales, eine neutrale Umgebung ist.
Yeah, and I'm quite happy to do that. Just a little story on men and women in the novel. Some years ago, I lived in central London. This is Greg again, by the way.
Es geht wieder um Greg, seinen Sohn, vor einigen Jahren in London.
And there was a central garden, which only the people who lived in the square had the key to go in.
Okay, es gab einen Gemeinschaftsgarten für mehrere Mieter, die dort gewohnt haben.
But in the summer, we opened up the gardens to the public so that all the workers in offices around would come with their lunches and sit on the grass in the garden. Maybe 500 or 600 people would be spread around on the grass.
Also im Sommer kamen auch die Arbeiter und alle möglichen Leute, weil sie haben den Garten geöffnet. Jeder konnte in den Garten hinein.
And I had about 400 or 500 books to get rid of. They were all duplicates of different books. Some of them were by me, but they were mostly, modern fiction.
Also er hatte 400, 500 Bücher, die er zu viel hatte, meistens, die er doppelt hatte und einfach loswerden wollte.
So Greg and I went out with armfuls of books into the gardens, and we went up to people sitting having their lunch and said, "Would you like a book?"
Also Greg und er haben die Bücher angeboten, umsonst.
And all the women said, they jumped to their feet, they said, "Yes, read that, can I have this one? Can I have 3? Yes, thank you very much. Do I really not have to pay you?" We didn't give a single book to a man.
Kein einziger Mann wollte ein Buch.
They say, no, sorry, mate, no, I don't do that sort of thing.
Do you realize that the laughs in the audience are mostly from the female?
Yeah, men, why aren't you laughing? Or are there any men? Yeah. And so I wrote a little piece about this because when I was at university, it was generally taught that the rise of the novel, a famous book by an academic called Ewan, really was, in the 18th century in England, a rise of the English novel, this is, because there was a new class of women readers that made possible this new literary form.
Also der Roman in England ist im 18. Jahrhundert so populär geworden, weil es eine neue Gruppe von Leserinnen gab, die ihn sehr, sehr geliebt haben.
And I think nothing has changed, and that without women readers, the novel would be dead.
Also es hat sich bis heute eigentlich nichts geändert. Ohne weibliche Leser wäre der Roman tot.
So I think it's a kind of feminine form that male writers, when they enter, have to become somewhat womanly, actually. They have to become calculators of, and far more observant than they usually are, of the relationships between people.
Also Männer, wenn sie anfangen, Romane zu schreiben, müssen sie weiblicher werden. Das heißt, sie müssen zum Beispiel genauer ihre Umgebung beobachten, anders als das die meisten Männer so tun.
I think it is a form that plays on the strength that we, wrongly or rightly, guess that men are weaker at. I mean, all of cognitive psychology suggests that girl children start speaking better and sooner than men, and actually are more observant of the fine print, as it were, of relationships.
Also Mädchen entwickeln sich früher in vielen Dingen als Jungs.
And I think the novel has become an elaboration of that. Does the reading group phenomenon exist in Germany?
Ja, Lesegruppen gibt es, ja, Lesezirkel, ja, ja.
I mean, it swept through Britain. But nearly all the readers in these groups, I mean, they're occasionally men.
Ja, es gibt sehr wenige Männer in diesen
Lesezirkeln. And these are highly articulate, often. I mean, not always, but these are highly educated, and these are like academic meetings sometimes, or better, actually, than academic meetings. So it's an interesting thing that nothing has changed from the 18th century.
Seit dem 18. Jahrhundert hat sich im Grunde genommen nichts verändert. Although I think one of your readers, and he was a man, an Italian guy, wrote you a letter someday that he, by reading your novels, met his wife.
Oh no, I was signing in an Italian bookshop, and a man and wife came in with 3 children, and they said that he had seen her reading one of my books, and he had just read it. And he realized that it was a fantastic way to get talking to this beautiful girl. And they introduced me to their 3 children. And then half an hour later, another couple came in with a small child. And they had met through reading some other book of mine. And so somewhere in my papers is a picture of myself and all these children who existed courtesy of my books. And I was very touched by that. But it's obviously, I mean, men used to say only, you go to art galleries where beautiful women are, it'd be the chat-up line, oh, I've read that. Don't you think that Conrad is a little too something,
Also wir haben heute Abend sehr viel gelernt über die Literatur, über die Art und Weise, wie Ewan schreibt, wie er lebt, wie er denkt, über das politische Leben, über seine Bücher, über Shakespeare, über Angela Merkel. Und auch, dass es sehr viele Kinder gibt, deren Existenz den Roman von Ian McEwan zu verdanken ist. I could go on talking to you, like, I have so many more questions, but it was such a great pleasure. Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Ian McEwan.
Thank you. Thank you, Christoph. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Und ich habe noch...
Thank you very much. No, I'm good from here. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.
Und ich habe noch das Vergnügen, Ihnen sagen zu dürfen, dass Ian McEwan draußen nachher Bücher signieren wird. Ich hoffe, Sie hatten einen schönen Abend. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine gute Nacht. Auf Wiedersehen. Tschüss.